The wind carried dust and thunder that evening, rolling across the Wyoming plains in low growls that rattled the shutters of Samuel Hart's cabin. The air was heavy, damp with the promise of rain, and the horses in the corral shifted nervously, their silhouettes restless against the bruised sky. Samuel sat at the kitchen table with his rifle propped against the wall, half a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the storm gather as though it were a familiar enemy. He was used to storms. What he wasn't used to was the knock that came at sundown, sharp and deliberate, against the wooden door. He froze, glass halfway to his lips. No one came out this far after dark, not unless they had trouble strapped to their saddlebags. The knock came again, softer this time, almost pleading. Samuel rose slowly, boots scuffing the floorboards, his shoulders already tight with suspicion. He pulled the door open with one hand resting near the rifle by the frame. Two women stood on his porch. They were soaked from the ride, hair plastered to their cheeks, cloaks streaked with dust and rain. The younger leaned into the older's side, her face pale beneath the shadow of her hood, one arm clutching the other as if the mere act of standing required all her strength. The elder straightened against the wind, her eyes steady despite the fatigue etched deep around them. Both carried the unmistakable bearing of survival, silent, proud, unwilling to bend even under the weight of the storm. "We need shelter," the elder said, her voice low but certain. "Just for the night." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd been through this before, strangers appearing out of the dust with stories as thin as smoke. He opened his mouth to turn them away, to send them back down the trail before night swallowed them whole. But then the younger one shifted, raising her head just enough for her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were dark, sharp with recognition. "The scar," she whispered. Samuel went still. The storm cracked overhead, lightning spilling white across the porch, and for a moment he felt stripped bare. She couldn't have known. No one outside the men he'd once ridden with, and the memory he carried like a stone in his chest, could have known. "What did you say?" His voice came out rough, harsher than he intended. "The scar," she repeated, a little stronger now. She lifted her hand slightly, not pointing, not accusing, but certain. "The mark on your side, the one you got in the fire." His stomach turned cold. He had never spoken of it, not to his late wife, not to his daughter, not to the neighbors who sometimes wondered at the way he winced when bending. The fire had been years ago, a night of chaos and blood, when men burned what wasn't theirs to keep, and he had carried a child out of the smoke before collapsing. He thought the child had died. The elder woman steadied her sister and looked Samuel straight in the eye. "You remember," she said simply. "Because we do." Samuel's hand hovered at the rifle, but it wasn't suspicion that gripped him now. It was memory, hot, choking, unshakable. The storm broke then, rain pelting the cabin roof like thrown gravel, wind sweeping across the porch. The women did not flinch. They stood rooted, like they had braced for this moment all their lives. Samuel swallowed, his throat dry despite the storm. He should have shut the door, should have sent them away. Instead, he found himself stepping back, his voice lower, uncertain. "Come inside," he said. The elder nodded once, guiding her sister over the threshold. And as Samuel closed the door against the storm, the weight of that single word scar echoed louder than the thunder, binding the three of them to a past he had tried for years to bury. The lantern light wavered in the draft, as Samuel shut the door against the storm. The cabin felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing close with the weight of memory. He had meant only to give them a roof until the rain broke, nothing more. Yet the word lingered in his ears like an old wound reopening. Scar. The younger woman eased onto the bench near the hearth, her breath uneven, strands of damp hair clinging to her cheeks. The elder remained standing, shoulders squared, eyes never leaving Samuel, as if gauging whether he would throw them back into the night. He set his jaw, rubbing absently at the place beneath his shirt where skin twisted into ridges of old burn. "You've no right to know about that," he muttered, voice rough. The younger one lifted her gaze. There was no hesitation in her eyes, only certainty. We call it the mark of the fire. You carried me from it. Samuel's chest tightened. He had told himself for years that the girl had been lost smothered in smoke, or swallowed by the blaze that devoured half the valley that night. He remembered the heat, the screaming, the crack of rifles as men rode hard through the Cherokee camp. He remembered lifting a small body, coughing against the smoke, stumbling until the world went black. When he awoke days later, he bore the scar, but not the child. He assumed she had died, another name among too many. You can't be her, he said, though the denial sounded weak even to his own ears. My name is Ayanna, the girl said softly. I was 6 summers when the fire came. You laid me in the river's edge before you fell. The water carried me away from the flames. My sister found me downstream. The elder woman, Tala, stepped forward then, her presence commanding in its stillness. She speaks truth. I was the one who pulled her from the water. I watched you fall. We thought you dead, as you thought of her. It seems we were both mistaken. Samuel stared at them, the storm outside hammering against the roof as though it meant to drown the words. His mind pulled against it, but the memory lined up with their story too neatly to ignore. He could almost feel again the small weight of the child in his arms, the way her hair had smelled of ash and cedar, the silence that followed when he dropped into darkness. His hand trembled against the back of a chair. Why come here? Why now? Tala's jaw tightened. Because danger hunts us. We would not have sought you otherwise. Samuel's eyes flicked between them. They looked worn to the bone. Ayanna's cloak frayed at the hem. Tala's boots split from hard miles. This was no chance visit, no neighborly plea for kindness. Trouble had its claws in them, and by opening his door he had invited it inside. I'm no savior, he said, quieter than before. That fire burned the best parts of me out. Whatever you think I did. His voice trailed off. You gave her life, Tala cut in, steady as stone. That is not nothing. Ayanna reached for the edge of the table, her hand small but sure. I never forgot your face. Even with the smoke, even with the fear. The scar marked you then. It marks you still. Samuel looked away, toward the flames licking the hearth. He wanted to tell them to leave, that he owed nothing, that the past should stay buried. But the sound of Ayanna's voice stirred something he had long smothered, a reminder that what he carried was not only pain, but proof he had once done something worth remembering. The storm deepened outside, thunder rolling across the plains like drums of war. Samuel rubbed his scar again, staring at the two sisters who had walked out of memory and into his cabin, bringing with them danger, truth, and a story he could no longer run from. The storm rattled the cabin through the night, wind tearing at the shutters, rain lashing the roof like stones thrown by unseen hands. Samuel Hart sat at the edge of the table, a half-empty glass in front of him, though he hadn't touched it in an hour. The fire cast shadows that twitched across the walls, long crooked things that made the place feel more haunted than warm. He could hear the sisters moving quietly in the other room, their whispers low, careful. He told himself he should never have let them cross his threshold, that a man who lived alone with ghosts had no business inviting strangers into his home. And yet, when he thought of sending them back into the storm, the words wouldn't leave his throat. He leaned back in the chair, and for a moment his mind wandered, unbidden, to the face of his late wife. Laya had hated storms, always pressing close to him when thunder rolled across the plains. She had been gentle with the horses, tender with the sickly calves, and stubborn in the way women sometimes had to be to survive ranch life. Her absence lived in the walls of this place, stitched into the silence between each creak of timber. Letting these women stay was like daring the past to walk across his floor again. The door to the bedroom creaked, and the elder sister, Tala, stepped into the glow of the fire. Her eyes were steady, unflinching. We will be gone by morning, she said. You'll leave when the rain does, Samuel replied, his voice low. No sooner. Storm would drown a horse before sunrise. Tala regarded him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. We don't ask for more. Didn't think you did, he muttered, though the weight in his chest remained. She moved closer to the fire, warming her hands. In the silence, Samuel caught a sound he hadn't expected. The faint clatter of hooves against the boards of the stable outside. He rose fast, hand brushing the rifle by the wall, but Tala raised a hand. It's Ayanna. She tends to your horses. Samuel frowned. In weather like this? She says beasts feel storms, same as people. She calms them. Against his better judgment, Samuel opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Rain stung his face, sharp as grit. Across the yard, lamplight flickered inside the stable. He crossed quickly, boots sinking in the mud, and pushed the door open. There she was, the younger one, Ayanna, moving among his horses with a grace that stopped him cold. The gelding that usually shied from strangers stood calm as she stroked its neck, murmuring words he couldn't hear. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, loosening a strap here, tightening another. The animals leaned into her touch, ears flicking forward like they knew her. Samuel's breath caught. It was the same way Laia had worked with them, gentle but firm, patience wrapped in strength. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in the empty place she'd left behind, something dangerous in its familiarity. You've got their trust, he said, his voice cutting into the quiet. Ayanna turned, her face pale in the lamplight, rain dripping from her hair. They remember kindness, even when men forget. He didn't know how to answer that, so he only leaned against the frame, watching. She didn't press him, just turned back to the horses, moving with that same quiet assurance until the storm outside seemed less wild. When they returned to the cabin, Tala spoke again, her voice careful. We've been hunted. Men say we stole papers, deeds that were not ours. Samuel studied her, searching for lies, but found only weariness. Did you? Tala's chin lifted. No. We took what belonged to our people, proof of what was stolen from us first. But men with power don't care for truth, only for silence. The words hung heavy in the room. Samuel thought of the raid, of fire and screams, of his scar that burned even now as if the memory had never cooled. He saw his wife's smile in the shadows, heard Ayanna's soft murmur to the horses, and felt guilt stir like a restless ghost in his ribs. He didn't answer Tala, not with words. He only sat down again at the table, the storm still raging outside, and let the silence stretch between them like a truce neither fully trusted. That night, sleep came late to the cabin, and when it did, it carried ghosts that pressed close to every wall. The rain eased toward midnight, leaving the cabin steeped in a silence so heavy it almost rang in Samuel's ears. He sat with his back to the wall, boots stretched toward the embers of the fire, rifle across his lap. The women had retreated to the back room, though he doubted either of them slept. He hadn't closed his eyes once. Storms always left him uneasy, as though the air itself carried news. Tonight the quiet felt wrong, stretched tight, like the prairie holding its breath. Then came the sound, distant at first, a dull rhythm that grew clearer with each heartbeat. Hoofbeats. Samuel rose, every muscle tensed. He stepped to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain. Through the streaked glass he saw shadows moving against the pale wash of moonlight. 4 riders, maybe 5, keeping to the edge of the ridge, silhouettes low in their saddles. They didn't turn toward the house, not yet, but the sight was enough to sour his gut. Men didn't ride at this hour without reason. Behind him, floorboards whispered. Tala stood near the window, her eyes following the same line of shadows. Bounty hunters, she said under her breath, as certain as if she'd spoken their names. Samuel turned to her sharply. You'd better start explaining. The younger sister appeared then, pale in the firelight, cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders. Ayanna's gaze flicked to the ridge, then back to Samuel, her lips pressed thin with fear she was trying hard to hide. He set the rifle against the wall, not out of comfort, but because anger made his hands shake. I let you in out of the storm. Now you bring riders to my door? What is it you haven't told me? Tala's chin lifted, her voice steady. We didn't bring them. They've been following for days. They'll follow until the earth swallows us, or the truth does. What truth? Samuel's voice rose louder than he meant, echoing against the rafters. You talk of scars and fire, but you haven't said why men with guns would cross half the territory for two women on a trail. Silence stretched. Ayanna looked at her sister, then back at him, her dark eyes bright in the glow of the dying fire. Because we took something. Not gold, not cattle, papers. Proof of what was stolen from our people land, grazing rights, water. Deeds signed in shadow, names forged with ink that reeked of lies. Samuel's jaw clenched. So they're not bounty hunters. They're hired hands, sent to clean up the mess before anyone sees it. Tala nodded once. They'll paint us as thieves, criminals, but what we carried was ours. The men who hunt us know it. The room seemed smaller with their words in it. Samuel's hand drifted unconsciously to his side, where the scar twisted beneath his shirt. He remembered the fire, the chaos, the way he'd carried Ayanna through smoke thick enough to choke a man. He had told himself it was chance, an accident that bound him to her. But standing here, with the ridge crawling with shadows, he knew better. The scar was not just his burden, it was the tether that tied their lives together, whether he wanted it or not. He exhaled slowly, dragging a chair back from the table and lowering himself onto it. If what you say is true, you've made enemies that won't stop until they bury the evidence and you with it. Ayanna's hands tightened on the cloak around her shoulders. Then we need someone who remembers the fire, someone marked by it. Her eyes dropped to his side, to the scar she swore proved his part in their survival. Samuel felt the weight of it heavy as iron. He had tried to bury the past in silence, in whiskey, in the long work of days on a ranch too big for one man. But ghosts didn't stay buried. They rode under moonlight, passed along ridges, and whispered against the windows of men who thought themselves alone. He rubbed his face with one calloused hand, the other resting near the rifle. You've brought your trouble here. That much is done. What comes next? He looked at them both, his voice low, resigned. It seems I don't get to walk away from this. Not anymore. Outside, the hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the plains. But the silence they left behind was worse than the storm. It meant the hunters knew where to look, and sooner or later, they would come. The cabin smelled of damp wool and wood smoke, the storm still dripping from the eaves outside. Samuel sat at the table, the stack of folded papers spread out before him like a deck of cards weighted with sin. He had resisted at first, telling the sisters he wanted no part of their fight, but Tala had insisted, her voice hard as stone, and now here he was, reading line after line in the flicker of lamplight. The handwriting was elegant, too neat to belong to a ranch hand. The words cut deeper than any knife. Deeds, contracts, agreements marked with signatures he knew as well as his own. Caleb Branson, the banker who poured whiskey at church socials. Sheriff Dell, the man sworn to uphold the law but whose name sat crooked on a contract for grazing land that had never been his to sell. Even Reverend Pike, who had prayed over Samuel's wife's grave, appeared on the list, binding his seal to a false transfer of water rights. Samuel's throat tightened as he turned page after page. These weren't strangers. These were men who shook his hand in town, who nodded from the boardwalk, who tipped their hats at his little girl. The names dragged his scar open again, reminding him that the fire hadn't ended in smoke and ash, it had lived on in the pockets of powerful men. He pushed back from the table, running a hand over his face. These are men I know, he said, his voice gravel. Men I've broken bread with. You're telling me they paid for that fire, paid for those riders? Tala stood in the corner, arms folded, gaze steady. We don't have to tell you. The proof is in your hands. He slammed a palm down on the papers, the sound echoing through the cabin. And what do you expect me to do with it? Ride into town and accuse half the council of theft? Ayanna had been silent until then, her dark eyes fixed on the scar visible at the edge of his collar where his shirt had slipped open. Slowly, she stepped closer, her voice quiet but cutting. You carried me through the fire. I remember the heat, the roar of it. I remember your arms, the way you stumbled but didn't let go. You laid me at the river's edge before the smoke took you down. I thought you died. Every day since, I carried that memory like a prayer. And now I see you with the mark of it still upon you. Samuel froze, his chest tightening at the sound of her words. He had buried that night, told himself the child had vanished, that his efforts had been wasted. To hear her speak of it with such clarity made the room tilt beneath him. You weren't supposed to survive, he whispered, more to himself than to her. I thought the river claimed you. That scar's been my reminder of failure ever since. Ayana shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek though her voice did not waver. It wasn't failure. You saved me, you lived, and so did I. The scar is not shame, it is bond. Her words struck deeper than the papers on the table. Samuel looked at the sisters, one fierce and unyielding, the other carrying memory like a flame. The weight of his guilt pressed hard, but beneath it something shifted, something he had not felt in years, the sense that his suffering had meaning, that the scar he hated was more than just flesh twisted by fire. He leaned heavily on the table, staring down at the names again. Men he trusted, men he could no longer look at the same. The cabin seemed smaller, the night darker. And for the first time, Samuel Hart realized that the past he thought buried had not just come knocking it, had dragged him into a blood debt he could no longer ignore. The morning broke with a false kind of peace, the sky painted in streaks of rose and pale gold over the plains. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling like tiny shards of glass, and for a moment Samuel thought maybe the night's shadows had passed them by. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, the air sharp in his lungs. The sisters were already awake, Tala standing by the window, her bow slung across her back, and Ayana feeding the horses as if tending to them might keep the world steady. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats, steady, too many to be chance riders. Samuel's gut tightened. He saw them crest the ridge, 4 men, maybe 6, riding hard with the rising sun at their backs. They cut a dark line across the horizon, dust rising behind them like smoke from a fuse already lit. Samuel cursed under his breath and called out, "They're here." Tala joined him on the porch, eyes narrowing. Bounty hunters, same as last night. They won't be asking this time, Samuel muttered. He loaded a fresh round into the chamber, the metallic click sharp in the morning stillness. The riders pulled up just short of the corral, their leader raising a hand. He was tall, lean, with a face weathered by sun and malice. His voice carried across the yard. "Hart, you've got something that doesn't belong to you. Send the women out, and we ride away. Refuse, and this place burns." Samuel didn't answer right away. He stood firm on the porch, scar aching beneath his shirt as if it knew the weight of the moment. "This is my land," he called back. "And no one gets taken off it against their will. You want a fight, you'll have one." The leader's smile was a thin slash. "So be it." The first shot rang out, cracking through the morning calm. Samuel ducked, firing back in quick reply. The yard exploded with gunfire, bullets splintering fence posts and kicking dirt into the air. Horses screamed in their stalls. Tala moved like a shadow, drawing her bow with a practiced grace. An arrow whistled through the chaos and buried itself in a man's throat, dropping him before his pistol cleared its holster. Ayana darted low across the yard, knife in hand. She had sworn never to raise it again, but the oath shattered the moment steel flashed toward Samuel. She lunged, driving the blade into the attacker's side before he could fire, her breath coming hard, eyes wild with the shock of it. Blood sprayed her hands, and she staggered, but she did not let go. Samuel fired from the porch, dropping another man who had taken cover behind the water trough. But as he turned to reload, a shot ripped across the yard and struck him high in the shoulder. The force spun him backward, slamming him against the post. He gritted his teeth, vision blurring, hot blood seeping through his shirt. Samuel, Ayanna cried, dragging him down behind the porch rail as bullets chipped wood above their heads. Tala loosed another arrow, her face grim, her hands steady despite the chaos. One hunter fell, then another, until the survivors cursed and scrambled for their mounts. The leader glared back from the saddle, his voice like a promise carved in stone. "This ain't finished, Hart. You'll bleed for this, all of you." Then he spurred his horse and vanished into the rising dust, his men trailing close behind. Silence returned, broken only by Samuel's ragged breathing. Ayanna pressed her hands against his wound, her face pale but determined. "Stay with us. Don't you dare leave me again." He forced a grim smile through the pain. Wasn't planning on it. Tala lowered her bow, scanning the horizon, her jaw tight. "They'll be back, stronger, and with more." Samuel leaned his head against the porch post, blood seeping between Ayanna's fingers, the scar on his side burning like fresh fire. He knew she was right. This was only the beginning. The cabin smelled of blood and smoke, though neither fire nor fresh death lingered in the yard anymore. Samuel lay stretched across his bed, shirt torn open at the shoulder where the bullet had passed clean through. The wound burned hot with each breath, but the sisters had stanched the bleeding and wrapped him tight with linen strips torn from an old feed sack. Every movement hurt, but it wasn't pain alone that kept him awake. It was the weight of what they had placed on his table, the stack of folded deeds and contracts that seemed heavier than iron. Tala sat at the table now, the papers spread in neat rows beneath the glow of the lantern. Her face was carved in shadow, sharp and resolute, as though she had been waiting years to lay this truth bare. Ayanna hovered near Samuel's bed, her hands restless, smoothing the quilt, checking the bandage, whispering small reassurances she probably meant more for herself than for him. "You've seen their names," Tala said at last, her voice carrying no tremor. "The men who did this to us. They wear the faces of neighbors, of leaders. But the land beneath our feet tells a different story." Samuel shifted against the pillow, gritting his teeth. "I knew some of them," he said. "I worked cattle under Branson when I was younger, rode fence for Pike's men. I trusted them." His eyes flicked to the papers. "I should have known better." Tala reached for one of the deeds, sliding it toward him across the table. "This one is the worst. It shows how Branson and the others claimed water rights by forging names of our kin who could not even write. Families starved because of this lie. The fire came later, but the fire was born here in ink, in greed, in theft." Samuel stared at the page until the words blurred. His scar throbbed, pulling him back into memory. The night of the raid, the smoke that filled his lungs, the weight of a child in his arms. He remembered stumbling through the flames, his shirt catching fire, the searing agony across his side. He remembered dropping to his knees on the riverbank and blacking out, believing he had failed. That scar had haunted him every day since. "You carried me," Ayanna whispered, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "You laid me down by the river, and you didn't let go until you couldn't hold on anymore. I remember your face through the smoke. I remember the sound of your voice, telling me to run, though I was too small to understand. That scar you hated isn't shame. It is proof that you chose us over them, even then." Samuel closed his eyes, the memory burning as bright as the wound in his shoulder. He had told himself for years that it was an accident, that he had stumbled into their fight by chance. But hearing her now, seeing the deeds inked with the names of men he once rode beside, he knew the truth. That night had been a line drawn in fire, and he had already chosen which side of it he stood on. The silence in the cabin pressed close, broken only by the creak of the rafters and the steady rasp of Samuel's breathing. Tala's eyes fixed on him across the room. "You know what must be done. These papers can bring them down, but we cannot do it alone. If you stay silent, their lies will live on. If you speak, you risk everything." Samuel let the words hang, heavy as the storm clouds gathering again outside. His scar itched beneath the bandages, an old wound answering the call of an old promise. He looked at Ayanna, at the way she clutched the edges of her cloak as though bracing against the world, and then at Tala, whose gaze never wavered. His voice was hoarse, but steady. I've carried ghosts long enough. Maybe it's time I carried something that matters. The ride into town felt heavier than any trail Samuel Hart had taken in years. The morning sun glared off the wet earth, turning the ruts to silver ribbons, but nothing in the light softened the weight of the papers tucked into his saddlebag. Each hoofbeat thudded like a drum calling him toward reckoning. Tala rode straight-backed beside him, bow slung across her shoulder, her silence steady as stone. Ayana followed close behind, her eyes fixed on the horizon, determination etched into every line of her face. By the time they reached the edge of town, word had already spread. Men stood on the boardwalk, pausing in their talk as the trio passed. Women at the mercantile pulled their children inside, shutters rattling closed as though the wind carried plague. Samuel kept his jaw set, though his stomach twisted at the sight. These were his people, or they had been once. Now every face looked like a judge weighing his soul. The saloon doors swung wide as they dismounted. Inside, the air hung thick with smoke and the smell of stale whiskey. At the far table, beneath the mounted horns of a bull, sat the men whose names blackened the deeds. Caleb Branson leaned back in his chair, cigar smoke curling from his lips. Sheriff Dell stood just behind him, one hand resting too casually on the butt of his pistol. Reverend Pike nursed a drink, eyes cold and watchful. There were others, too, lesser men who took their lead from power like dogs sniffing after scraps. Samuel pushed through the silence, boots heavy on the floorboards, until he stood across from them. He pulled the papers from his saddlebag and laid them on the table with a slap that echoed louder than any shot. "Your names," he said, his voice low, steady. "In your own hand, binding land that was never yours to claim." Branson smiled thinly, puffing his cigar. "You're a fool, Hart. Those papers don't prove a damn thing, just ink on old parchment. No one in this town will believe the word of two vagrant women and a rancher who can't keep his own house in order." Samuel felt the eyes on him, every man in the saloon waiting to see if he'd flinch. He wanted to. The scar on his side itched, his shoulder throbbed where the bullet wound still pulled at the stitches. But he stood firm. "I've bled for this land, same as my wife did. I know the truth when it's staring me in the eye." Sheriff Dell stepped forward, his voice like gravel dragged through mud. "You're siding with them, then? After everything? You'd stand against your own?" Tala's voice cut across the room, sharp as an arrow loosed from string. "He is standing with the truth, something you've forgotten how to do." A murmur rippled through the crowd that had gathered near the doorway. Men shifted uneasily. Pike slammed his glass down, his preacher's calm cracking. "You'd betray your neighbors for them? For savages who bring nothing but trouble?" Ayana stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife at her side. She did not raise it, but the gesture silenced the room. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clear. "I was 6 when your fire nearly burned me alive. He carried me from it, scarred himself to give me breath again. If that is betrayal, then what do you call men who steal from the dead and pray lies over the living?" The words struck harder than any bullet. Even Branson's smile faltered for a beat. Samuel saw it the truth too sharp to laugh away, the memory of fire flickering in the room like a shadow none of them wanted to face. "You'll hang for this," Dell growled finally, his hand twitching near his gun. "Trader's rope fits just as tight as a thief's." Samuel met his stare unflinching. If that's the price of standing on the right side of the fire, then so be it. For a moment, the saloon held its breath. Then Tala's bow creaked softly as she drew it halfway, notched, but not released. Ayana's fingers brushed her knife again, her eyes never leaving the men at the table. The lies had been spoken, but so had the truth, and it was the truth that rang louder in the silence that followed. No shot was fired, no rope was thrown. But as Samuel, Tala, and Ayana turned to leave, every man in that saloon knew the scar he carried was no longer his alone. It was the mark of a debt coming due, and none of them could escape it. The sky was black with smoke before they even crested the last ridge. Samuel knew the smell. First it carried sharp and bitter on the wind, the smell of timbers burning fast and low, the kind of fire that ate not only wood but memory. His heart dropped into his boots as he dug his heels into the mare's flanks, urging her faster. Beside him, Tala's face was set like carved stone, while Ayana leaned forward in the saddle, her eyes wide with fear she didn't voice. When they reached the edge of the yard, Samuel's worst fear clawed at him. Flames licked along the ranch house roof, smoke pouring out through the shutters. The corral was in chaos, horses screaming against the heat, and the barn glowed like a lantern. He saw figures moving through the haze, men with rifles and torches, laughing as they scattered fire like seed. "Get to cover," Samuel shouted, but he was already leaping from the saddle, rifle in hand. A bullet snapped past his head, splintering the porch post where he had stood only yesterday. The barons hadn't wasted time. They had brought men, too many, and each one carried the kind of resolve that came from fear, fear of truth getting out, fear of their lies unraveling. Tala dropped behind a water trough, loosing an arrow with deadly calm. One of the riders yelped and toppled, torch falling into the mud. Another cursed and ducked, but not before Ayana lunged from the shadows, knife flashing. Samuel heard the wet sound of steel finding flesh, then her cry as she shoved the man back into the fire he'd lit. But even over the gunfire and shouting, Samuel heard something else. A sound so small and piercing it froze him in place. A child's cry, muffled but desperate, rising above the roar of flames. "Maddie," he whispered. His daughter. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe. He had left her hidden in the barn loft, thinking the thick walls safer than town, safer than strangers. Now those same walls were burning. He turned to run, but pain knifed through his shoulder where the wound from the last fight had barely closed. His legs staggered beneath him. "I'll get her," Ayana shouted, her face pale with smoke and determination. She didn't wait for his protest. She tore across the yard, ducking low under gunfire, vanishing into the barn where fire snarled along the rafters. Samuel's world narrowed to the door she'd disappeared through. Each second dragged like a year. He fought beside Tala, firing shot after shot, but his eyes never left the barn. He thought of the scar on his side, the mark of his failure, the weight of a child lost in fire once before. The thought of it happening again nearly broke him. Then, through the smoke, Ayana stumbled out, coughing hard, her cloak wrapped tight around a small bundle. Maddie's cries rang out, sharp and alive. Alive. Ayana held her close as she staggered toward Samuel. Her face streaked with soot, hair tangled, but her grip unyielding. Samuel dropped his rifle, reaching for his daughter, pressing her against his chest with a tremor in his hands. Tears cut tracks down his smoke-stained cheeks as Maddie buried her face in his shirt. His scar burned then not with shame, but with memory, with proof. It wasn't failure carved into his flesh. It was survival, hers and his, bound together. The fight raged on, bullets tearing through the smoke, arrows hissing like serpents. Tala's bow sang, Samuel's rifle cracked, and Ayana, though coughing and staggering, still slashed her knife at any man who came too close. Together they pushed the Baron's men back, driving them through the yard and out into the open plains. By the time the last rider turned tail, the barn was half collapsed, and the ranch house little more than a blackened frame. The yard reeked of ash and blood. Samuel stood in the wreckage, Maddie clutched tight, and beside him, Tala and Ayana, both burned and bruised, but unbroken. The scar on his side throbbed, and for the first time in years he let it. It was no longer a curse. It was the reminder that he had carried a child out of fire once, and tonight, together, they had carried another. Survival was not silence anymore. It was defiance, standing in the smoke and saying they were still here. Dawn came slow, dragging pale light across the blackened bones of the ranch. Smoke still curled from the ruined barn, and the charred frame of the house stood against the horizon like a skeleton that refused to fall. Samuel Hart stood in the yard with his daughter pressed against his chest, her soft breath steady against his collarbone. Every muscle in his body ached, but the weight of her small body reminded him of what had been saved, not what had been lost. Beside him, Tala and Ayana moved quietly through the wreckage, gathering what could be salvaged, their faces smeared with soot but their eyes clear, unbroken. Word of the fire and the fight traveled faster than the smoke. By noon, riders from town had arrived, some carrying buckets of water, others only curiosity. Neighbors who had once turned away now stood in the yard, staring at the scorched earth, the bodies still laid out beneath tarps. Samuel did not speak at first. He let the silence do the work, let them see the cost of lies written in ash and blood. When at last he brought out the papers, deeds, contracts, the proof that tied Branson, Pike, and Dell to the theft of Cherokee land, no one looked away. Witnesses from the saloons stepped forward, too. They recalled the confrontation, the words that had cracked the room open like thunder. The sisters' testimony was added, calm and steady, and even those who had once dismissed them could not ignore the truth when laid bare with names and ink. The cattle barons denied, of course. They sneered, they threatened, they blustered. But the fire had burned more than Samuel's house, it had burned away the last of their power. By week's end, Branson's bank was shuttered. Pike had vanished under cover of night, and Dell was stripped of his badge, his gun taken from his hip by men who no longer trusted him to wear it. Rebuilding began in pieces, plank by plank. Samuel cut charred beams into usable lengths, driving nails with his good arm while Tala steadied the wood. Ayana, though scarred by smoke and flame, tended the horses that had survived, her hands calm, her voice a low hum that soothed even the most skittish. The neighbors who had once gossiped and turned cold shoulders now came with wagons of supplies, lumber, rope, jars of preserves. They did not apologize outright, but their presence was its own kind of confession. Samuel accepted it without bitterness. He no longer carried space for that weight. Each night, when the hammering ceased and the day cooled, he would sit on the porch with Maddie asleep in his lap. The sisters often joined him. Tala spoke little, her eyes always scanning the horizon, but Samuel knew she had chosen to stay, not out of necessity but because something in her had anchored here. Ayana, softer but no less strong, told stories by the fire, her words carrying memory and promise in equal measure. Samuel's hand often drifted to his side, to the scar that had haunted him for years. But when his fingers brushed the ridged skin now, it no longer burned with shame. It was a mark of survival, a reminder that the fire had not taken all. It had bound him to the sisters, to the truth, to a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and trial. When the new house stood upright, strong and unyielding, Samuel looked at it with something close to peace. The land still carried scars, as he did, but both would heal. The barons were gone, the lies exposed, and what remained was honest, however rough. On the first morning in the rebuilt cabin, Samuel woke to the sound of laughter, his daughter's high and bright, mingling with Ayana's gentle voice and Tala's low, rare chuckle. He lay still for a moment, letting it soak through the walls, letting it wash over the years of silence. For the first time since the fire that had marked him, he no longer felt alone. The scar was no curse. It was kinship, survival, and a new dawn rising across the plains. And as the sun broke over the horizon, Samuel Hart stepped outside into its light with his family beside him, ready for whatever came next.